Again, our speakers have been absolutely vorbildlich. We're fast. I'll still try to limit myself to a 5 to 7 minute response. Then Joacim is going to say a few words, and then we'll have ample time for discussion, hopefully. As my co-moderator and co-respondent just bid me farewell when I walked over here, see you on the other side. It's been an incredibly rich morning, and I don't see, obviously I cannot do justice to everything you've heard, and rather than privileging any single of these talks, or also maybe returning to some of the talks and some of the discussion that we have already had yesterday, although there will be short instances at which I flash, or at which I might try to flash up, bring up memories, I try maybe a little bit, something like an early halftime summary. We're almost halftime at this conference. And it's a little bit, I'm trying to respond to what we've seen in total at this point. The first observation that I'd have is that, or the first question that I have is, what's the state of the field? And I would like to preface that, step back and say maybe we are already witnessing the birth of a field, and that field would be Warburg studies now. And there's an immense body of scholarship now. It's very different from, say, even 10 years ago when I started working on Warburg, where you could, you had a few books that you needed to work with, and you always needed to return to Gombrich if you weren't here in London to secure that situation. So we might be witnessing really the birth of Warburg studies at this point. The question, how desirable is that? There are benefits and drawbacks to an institutionalization or to an epistemological institutionalization such as the one we may be witnessing here. Will we be seeing the birth of a Warburg philology, maybe, of Warburg studies? Will there be a journal of Warburg studies? I don't know. But coming back to the question of a Warburg philology, there is certainly something in the work of Warburg, and that is something that has been coming up across numerous of the talks we've heard, we've been privileged to hear over the last 1.5 days. And that also goes back to my experience in working on Warburg. You need philology to a certain extent really to complete or to respond to the nature of the work that you're witnessing. It is so fragmentary in part, the argument that you encounter. It's a different, say, nature of fragmentariness that you would encounter in the Romantics. It's a different nature of fragmentariness that you would encounter in Nietzsche, for instance. Sometimes he's just spewing out ideas, as you know, and you really need to be able to draw conjectures, to need to return to the sources, sometimes simply to complete the argument that is there, but you need to be aware of the fact that you're doing this through a philological process, I'd say. The other aspect to which that responds is obviously that immense and very fortuitous institutionalization that this body of work has experienced in the nature of the Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliothek first, and the Warburg Institute here in the Warburg House in Hamburg. As threatened as these institutions have been at certain points in their history, but I think we're very lucky to say they're here. So we're now faced with this, it's almost like a Janus-faced legacy. On the one hand, very fragmentary, on the other hand, secured. There's a whole archive, and there's even a library that goes with the work. Like, in what other intellectual project would you be facing such a situation? Benjamin studies, another field that I'm in, faces a very different constellation. Now, to conclude my very brief remarks here, I think if we want to return to, or if we want to carry on Warburg's thought, and this has certainly also been an idea behind this conference, if I understand David and Claudia correctly, if we want to do that, I think we need to be aware of two aspects. First, in order not to reinvent the wheel every single time, we maybe can also look back on what has been done already. And the project that I'm very privileged to be a member of, and that also pays my living at this point, the Bilderfahrzeuge project, is a product, I think, of the returned, or the strong engagement with Warburg's thought that has been taking place in Germany over the past almost 25 years, I'd say. And obviously also the refoundation of the Humboldt-Universität with the Institut für Kulturwissenschaft and now it's the Institut für Kunst- und Bildgeschichte has profited enormously from a rediscovery of Warburg's work. Same the Zentrum für Literaturforschung, I'd say. The last thing I'd have to say is that if we want to return to Warburg, I think we need to be aware of the conjectural nature of the arguments that we will be drawing from his work, which returns again to the fragmentary basis of this thought that we're encountering. We need to be aware of the necessity for speculation, which is a spirit that I dare say goes against a certain zeitgeist at the moment, which I think, as I see it in the encounter with the Naturwissenschaften, which we need to carry forward, has a tendency towards positivism. So we need to be courageous, as it were, and not shy away from empiricism, but I think we cannot succumb to the imperative for positivist research. Thank you.
I totally agree with my colleagues' comments that we can see two main strands of Warburg and Warburg research in contemporary society. One that is more driven to archival research and to philology, and to the Warburg Studien, the future journal, the flagship of our discipline, maybe our subject, and a more speculative, theoretical understanding of Warburg's achievements. And I completely agree that we need to have a kind of correspondence and a mutual understanding for each other's work if we want to actually move on with Warburg and not stay with this kind of standard model of Warburg that we are so accustomed to. Yes. This morning was almost an impenetrable experience, especially for me, if you had the ambition of summarizing these distinguished speakers. And of course, that is not possible, and this is a celebratory conference and not an archive seminar. But I thought that I could sense two major questions or themes arising in the different speakers' talks. And one was the more philological and archive-based, trying to pinpoint certain influence that might have influenced Warburg, or that Warburg influenced someone else, like Panofsky, for instance, in Elisabeth Seer's talk. And that raises, of course, questions of more fundamental methodological issues. What is influence? And how do we construct histories? How do we frame Warburg? And what agendas are underlying the framing, so to speak? I will not delve into the complicated issues of influence, but just remind you all what Michel Foucault writes in Archéologie du Savoir, that influence is often a kind of magic in order to stitch things together. It would be interesting also to hear from all of the speakers how this stitching, this framing will change the image of Warburg, his legacy, and maybe even the future of the Warburg Institute. Do the talks contribute to a reshaping, revision of Warburg as a historical person or as a theoretical person? If I may make a kind of allusion to Overbeck's understanding of theology, that we have a theology of Jesus as an historical person and theology as, theology as a more theoretical discipline. The other section that I could sense was Warburg and his institution, and question about research then and now, especially in Bredekamp and Seer's talks. Seers showed us a small heading for Warburg's understanding of his library, and he called it an Institute for Methodological Transgression. And that is interesting. Can different disciplines and different methodological approaches coincide within the same department, the same institution? How free-minded, how tolerant are we against each other? I think that is a question that we need to take seriously, especially since most of the talks, in a way, had a very philological and intellectual outlook that seemed almost the same. It also raises question of how free are we as a researcher. And I think that both CS and Bredekamp touched upon that issue, and Bredekamp talked a little bit about the freedom of research institution, and CS mentioned Denkform. That reminded me of Ludwig Fleck, the German epistemologist's little book on Denkstil and Denkkollektiv, how we actually influence each other, and how we as a laboratory or a community of scholars may influence and create consciously and unconsciously thought patterns that reoccur. And that touches a little bit on my own research, trying to see not on the great persons in the Warburg community, Panofsky, Saxel, but rather his students. And that is another historiographical point. Why look at the great men and not the students? Why the men and not the women? What not have a paper on, for instance, the probable influence of Jane Ellen Harrison, the first British professor? These are just questions that I felt necessary to ventilate when I heard these talks. And hopefully they will spur more questions during our Q&A. Thank you.
If you wish. Would you like to go on?
Yeah. So the first question is down here. We'll take questions right away.
Hi, I have a question for Quentin Skinner. What do you make of the difference between the two states of the frontispiece, between the people looking outwards and the people looking upwards? You did make the implicit, the boss connection is clear from the other plate, but I'm asking this with a particular comparandum in mind, which is a draft of a poster of 1930 by Gustav Klutz's communist visual propaganda, in which images of people looking outward at the viewer of the poster were actually either censored or edited out and replaced by images of people looking upward, implicitly at the leader who himself was looking at the rosy dawn of the revolution. I think there's probably danger in sort of projecting possible meanings of looking upward at the ruler backward from 1930 to 1651, but I wonder if you do see some sort of particular iconographic meaning in a change from looking out to looking up.
Are these your? Yes. Is this working? Well, thank you. It's an extremely good question, but the surprising answer is that in both cases, the image is the same, because you have to ask about who it is for. In the published version of the image, the individual members of the multitude, by the way, men, women, and children are all displayed, even some babies, they are all looking up to, and notice the visual metaphor again. Looking up to someone means respecting them, as well as the physicality of looking up to them. So what are they looking up to? They're looking up to the head of state, that's to say, the artificial person, the representative of the multitude, who is also an actual person. Now go back to the manuscript in which these faces are staring outwards. But who are they looking at? They're looking at the person for whom the manuscript was intended. So they're looking up at the sovereign.
Thank you. Okay, this is a question for Callum Ginsburg. Thanks, first of all, for that new genealogy that you opened up concerning the pathos form. Very convincing, I thought, but I have some little doubt left about Pseudo Longinus and the tradition of the sublime and how this might tie in. Because as far as I'm familiar with 18th century aesthetics and the interest in mixed emotions that can be found on different fields. It can be the sublime, mixing fear and pleasure. It can be the tragic, mixing suffering and pleasure, and it can be melancholy, the joyful grief. These are all, facets of mixed emotions in the 18th century, and they all are triggered somehow by Boileau translating Pseudo Longinus. And these mixed emotions are somehow mixing, mingling, balancing, and scaling down the extremes of the emotions. I think that's the key of the concept. Winfried Menninghaus has recently been reassessing this tradition, and he has the thesis about mixed emotions, figuring one emotion and using the negative emotion as a sort of catalyst, as adding spice to the emotion. And what Warburg envisions with pathos formal, first of all, of course, is not emotions convening in one individual, but stretching out over history, being passed on and transformed. And what he diagnoses, as far as I read him, is more of a dialectical movement. It's how a very extreme can surprisingly resurface, showing another very extreme emotion. There's nothing about the mixing, the mingling, the balancing and the scaling down that I think the history of the mixed emotions triggered by Boileau suggests. So that's how does it tie in?
Thank you very much. Is this working? Yeah. Thank you very much for your comment. But we are confronted with a text, its transmission and its reception, and Reynolds' reading of it. He referred to Longinus, to the treatise, and he also wrote that remark about, let's say, the same expressions refer to opposite emotions. So I think that we are confronted with the possibility of Reynolds reacting to something which is both in the text and in the reception of it. And I think that this is the case. So it's the most economic explanation I can find. I'm well aware that, in fact, the idea of mixed emotions is very different, in a way more conventional than the idea of, let's say, contrasting emotions, overpowering a single individual, as in the case of Sappho and the reading of Sappho's poem. But I think that this is a response which ultimately can lead to Aby Warburg.
This is another question for Quentin Skinner. You challenged medievalists. I am not a medievalist, but I'll play one for the moment. There's a mosaic in Santa Maria Novella in Rome showing the Battle of the Amalekites, in which Moses stands in the center with his arms outstretched, and the arms are being upheld by Aaron, who is the priest, and Hur, who is the general. As long as Moses' arms are up, the Israelites will prevail over the Amalekites. If his two ministers, the priest and the warrior, let his arms drop, then the Amalekites begin to win. This also became a prototype, I take it, for the Holy Roman Emperor. That's what I've always seen underneath Leviathan, is the general, the violence, the police, the military, and religion. So religion and war, and the sovereign controlling those two, but them also upholding his arms. Do you have any comment?
Well, thank you. Well, that's a fascinating iconographical example. Just one comment about the iconographical scope of my remarks. What I'm struck by is that the particular iconography that I was talking about, which of course is commonplace in Italian art, is unknown in British art until the period that I'm talking about. But I mean, there are celebrated cases in which everything is triangles. I mean, the Ultima Cena is the most obvious example, isn't it? To your immediate point, I don't disagree with anything that you say about what's going on in Leviathan, but why is the book called Leviathan? Leviathan is the name of the state, and this is, for Hobbes, an extremely abstract notion, but a word, persona fictione, and yet it is the person who puts you in jail and declares war. So how can a fiction put you in jail? The book is an attempt to answer that question, and what I'm focusing on is this very abstract notion of the state. I see it as a tremendous attempt on Hobbes's part to offer a kind of reassurance that this incredible idea is no more incredible than the central idea of your Christian faith.
May I make a quick comment on your comment?
Yes.
Yeah. Actually,
he knows much more about this than I do. So
about fictio, because I mean, on the one hand, obviously there is a reference to in your comment to legal fictiones.
Yes.
On the other hand, I argued, following the insight of an extremely insightful reader of Hobbes in Latin, meaning Giambattista Vico, that actually he was reading in Hobbes that famous line by Tacitus, fingunt simul creduntque. And this seems to me the epitome of Hobbes' front page. Because the people are looking up at the Leviathan and they made up that image, but then they believe in it.
Yeah.
So I think that Vico was right in detecting a reference to Tacitus in Hobbes' front page and also in Hobbes' argument.
Yeah, wonderful.
We can ask questions endlessly about the frontispiece, and my iconographical question is also to Quentin Skinner. Generations of naive readers have been puzzled at a question that also troubled Carl Schmitt in his book on the Leviathan very deeply, which is, what has happened to the whale? Where is the Leviathan itself? This troubled Schmitt not only because he loved Moby Dick and wrote on Melville, but also because Baudin had already identified the Leviathan as the symbol of sovereign violence. So where is the whale?
Well, it's a very good question, although I don't think that Schmitt gives an answer to it, which is very good. He thinks that it's a sublimation of English sea power, doesn't he? Which is not the only weird thing about that book. The whale in chapter 41 of the book of Job, I want to say, provides Hobbes with far more meaning than he needs, and far more meaning actually than he can cope with. What he needs is an image of supreme power. And the quotation from Job, which is crucial in Leviathan, is, "He is the king of the proud." He opposes pride, which is the central antisocial vice that humans are all guilty of, and ensures that peace is placed in the place of the war that would come from the exercise of pride. That's what he needs from it. But of course he's left with this image of a giant fish. He doesn't need it, he doesn't do anything with it. All he needs is what he quotes. That may not seem a very satisfactory answer. You'd like there to be a fish in the picture, would you? I mean, I'm very struck that he's got ahead of himself with this image. There's one thing he needs it for, but it's not. What do you think, Horst?
Yeah, this is, sorry.
Yeah.
Shall I?
Horst would like this.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No, this is a major question in Carl Schmitt, of course, and he was right. Thomas Hobbes changed the monsters.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons is that Schumann found it out, and I found other sources, that Thomas Hobbes relied not mainly, but with one source to the Codex Hermeticum, which in the Hobbes studies this idea was more or less forbidden till 20 years ago. Yeah. He quoted, it's very clear that he read the version of the Codex Hermeticum through Patrizi, because he took a quotation and a wrong translation of Patrizi. So it's quite clear from where he got the source. He had altogether 12 copies of the Codex Hermeticum. In the Asclepius, you have the idea that the human beings, the Egypts, shape a statue of a goddess which has a wisdom that no human being has. And it gives the rules to the human beings and to the society. There is the model of an idol which is mortal, created by human beings, and has the shape of a human being, a giant. And that is one of the reasons Hobbes tried to find the most majestic figure which he could attract to the Leviathan. So that is one. May I also give a comment on Quentin, or should we put that to the lunch?
Okay.
I have two audience, but maybe can we...
No, this has been a very patient audience. I think we should, it's your turn.
I have a question for Professor Sears. Without asking you to give another paper, I wonder if you could respond to the what happens if we don't just do great men question. I mean, I know you've, having worked on the Warburg Circle and having spent a lot of time talking to Margaret Vint, Edgar Vint's widow. So, yeah, what happens if it's not just the great men? What does it look like?
Yeah, thanks. This is also an answer to Joachim's question. What has emerged from these efforts to reshape, reframe Warburg, which again gets to what David's hoping for, and who do we study? I suppose I've been myself trying indeed to go to the less looked at people. There's getting to be, Ben's right in the audience, there's getting to be, and Pablo, a new Vint cabal. There are things going on. He offers a very different way of looking at things, and Panofsky, in fact, in a letter I just came across, calls Vint one of the people who is most actively engaged in reinterpreting Warburg direct, in a sense. But, I've been finding, and I think that was my last statement, that there are so many ways to look at Warburg reception, and it's so varied, and perhaps our tendency to see what later iconology did and to read back and then to look for betrayal or misunderstanding is just not the most interesting way to go, or we've got a good deal out of that, and maybe there are other things to do. I've been finding that there's a lot of response to Warburg direct. I worked a bit on his last Hertziana lecture, and it's really possible from various letters and Tagebüchen things to see what was made of Warburg's lecture by E.R. Curtius, by Eugenie Sprung, by very important the Dutchman Hogewerf, by Franz Cumont. You can really put together the way these people reacted directly to Warburg, and they're quite surprising and different. And Hogewerf, I would say, he and Warburg have an exchange, and they talk about what iconology is. And I would say in 1927-28, Hogewerf in an Oslo conference was the first, to my knowledge, to separate, to put iconography and iconology against one another. Look in Warburg, you can count up the number of times that he used the word iconography or the number of times he used the word iconology. I think they had very specific and very different meanings, and I don't think he hierarchized them. I just don't think that was part of his thinking. Whereas it begins to be with Hogewerf, and Panofsky read Hogewerf's article of 1931 as the hierarchy is being defined. So anyway, I would just say that there are a whole slew of secondary figures. Alfred Neumeier, how interesting is he, who went to a seminar by Warburg, ends up in Mills College in Oakland, California, of all things, and ends up being the first person, I think, ever to give a seminar on Warburg back in Germany in the later 50s. So there's a great field, I would say, of further study.
Also, I would like to describe for Peter Miller the decades-long, very vivid and very productive scholarship in Kulturwissenschaft in Europe. But since we are allowed only to put one question, I address my question to Callum Ginsburg. Carlo, you know that and I would like to follow David Friedberg's interest in gaining contemporary questions. And you know my collaboration with scholars and colleagues from medicine and surgery who are in a very practical way occupied with questions of morphology of the body. And there, what we observe is that the question of beauty plays an enormous role for the reaction of sympathy and antipathy. And therefore, I was very interested in your analysis of this shift from the discourse on beauty to an engagement with expression of emotion, pathos formula, and so on. And this brings me to the question how it would be possible to connect these two fields of scholarship. So scholarship on sympathy, and this is today mostly called empathy. And there is very rare scholarship yet on the contrary, on antipathy. I looked up, but it's very rare. And if there is something, it's connected to beauty or disgust or something like that. And what has this problem to do with this question of contrary expressions in the same pathos formula? Do you see any linkage between both? Because that's what bothers me since long. And I would like to ask you whether you have some ideas.
Thank you very much for your question. I would reject the word empathy as analytically significant. It seems to me that empathy is a shortcut, and it's also misleading. And what I would oppose to empathy in humanities is philology. In a broad sense, in Giambattista Vico's sense, including, let's say, antiquarian studies as well, the analysis of written, visual, all kind of evidence. But empathy implies that we are able to identify ourselves with the past or the distant present. This is a lie. This is a lie. I think that we have to learn the language of the others, and I think that, let's say, we have to reject empathy and, of course, identity as a weapon against the others. So we are confronted with, let's say, a lot of perplexing phenomena, and I'm personally very much interested in ambivalence. So ambivalence is a sort of subjective reaction to something which takes place, and we have to decipher. But you may start from ambivalence, and then the list would be much longer. Thank you.
Horst, would you like to comment on Quentin?
I thought it was for the lunch. but if there is nobody else,
Yes.
I
Hello?
could.
Hello?
I think there are more questions.
This follows directly on from the last question. It's to do with the pathos formula. And it's a very simple question about Warburg. Was he or any in his circle studying dance? There was at that time a revolution in dance going on with the Ballet Russe, Michel Fokine, Nijinsky, the dancers at Hellerau, the new kinds of dance, and Isadora Duncan. And it seems to me that classical ballet and its modern versions remained at that point a store of classical gesture unparalleled in painting and sculpture by that time, which had been virtually abandoned in painting and sculpture, but still alive in classical ballet. And it seems odd that anybody interested in the historical evolution of gesture would not take an interest in dance. A slightly related topic would be to ask, was Warburg interested in Kleist's essay on the marionette theatre, because of what Kleist says very specifically about the possibilities of gesture in the marionette.
So did you want anyone in particular to respond? Maybe I missed that. Was that in general for the program?
Sounds as if it's for Carlo.
Well, I could say one small thing. I can't say that I know, or others may, of Warburg being interested in classical dance. One interesting thing is Kenneth Clark, who so much felt that his life had been changed by having exposure to Warburg in 1929, did say that he was extremely interested in classical dance, going to Sadler's Wells all the time, and he thought that this would be a great link to Warburg, and it was important for his own work in gesture. Warburg himself, this is one interesting small point. There was an ethnographer, I'm not going to pronounce his name correctly, Pospisil, can you do this? Pospisil. Anyway, he became connected with the Warburgians and met Warburg. And Warburg was very excited by the fact that he was doing films of sword dances. And so this is a place where animated dance, and we're not talking about classical dance, but that this was something he was regarding as important to record and to get movement into film. It seems interesting. Anybody else?
Gabriele Brandstätter has worked in their scholarship on Warburg and dance. I don't know.
Ekardt, we can't hear you.
Sorry. There is scholarship about Warburg and dance, at least in German. Gabriele Brandstätter has worked on that. I'm not aware of any translations, but there are linkages. The extent to which he saw the material is questionable, but there are, or it's not. There's material out there. We have a question over here, and then Dave. Would you like to respond, David, directly?
No, you go on. And then
okay. We have a question over here, and then David Friedberg, please.
Okay, thank you. I want to return to Horst Bredekamp's discussion about Warburg as an institution, or Warburg's project as an institution. And I want to try to think and sort of tie this to his privileging of passions and pathos. And it seems like all his, the privileged position he gives to expression and the notion of passion comes perhaps from a critique of the sort of academic project, which is not Reynolds, the earliest precedent, it is Lebrun. So Lebrun, Passions of the Soul, going back into Descartes and Aristotle. So for me, it was striking to try to link both. So it seems that his insistence on expression and passions, perhaps tied to his interest in reconstructing or creating a new institution, could be seen as a critique of the earlier academic project and painting. And this is perhaps why he turns into science and Darwin, as perhaps Lebrun had looked into Descartes, the science of his day. So in this context, this sort of disjunction between form and emotions and types is a problem he finds in trying to project science on what is already there. So it's not necessarily internal to his work. So I wanted, this preference for expression and passions in relation to his ambition for an institution, and which is perhaps not carried further down into Vince's work, who looks into contemporary art as well, modern art, which is something Warburg doesn't do.
Yeah, thank you for this very complex question that gives me the chance to very briefly answer to Quentin. No, if I may, so is it allowed that an answer has two poles?
Yeah. You're the sovereign.
I thought it was an amazing talk you give, and I would underline your central point that the figuration is abstract and corporal in the same sense by coming to a point which is attached to Abraham Bosse and Lebrun. Abraham Bosse was professor at the Academy for Perspective, and he denied, he did everything to punctually use perspective. He was also a mathematician of high degree. And he, being forced to figure out Louis XIV, put him into a Euclidean central perspective space. That was forbidden because the real sovereign, Louis XIV, did not want to be subordinated under rules of mathematics. Abraham Bosse rejected, and he was fired. So Lebrun painted Louis XIV in a non-perspectival way, putting him in a Leonardesque sfumato, and thus individualizing the Leviathan into a sublime personalization, which Abraham Bosse rejected. And this is again an argument that would support your collaboration between Bosse and Hobbes very, I think, obviously. That is one point. And now I come to the second. Thomas Hobbes once argued, my mother is anxiety. And that is it's all about the fear of civil war. And one could say the same about Aby Warburg, the fear of violence. One of his deepest going in his early years impressions was he talks about it and writes about it, that an enlightened young Russian teacher, female, goes to to a village, and by a mass which gets mad, she is Jewish, is torn into pieces, is one of the terrors of anti-Jewish campaigns in Russia. This event, nymphs, menads, all of this is in his subconsciousness forever. So when he thinks about institutions, he thinks about institutions also as a kind of structural weapon against these uncontrollable Dionysian forces. And if I may end with a third point to the very important philological points you gave in your comments, but this is not enough. Warburg is thinking of something which is confronting us, violence. We are in an epoch of fear. And that is why the method of Warburg to take it into account and try to find out via pathos formula and institutions, for example, to push back the unforceable force of violence, be it individual, which he had in himself, being social as a common affair. So I won't bridge too artificially, but between Hobbes and Warburg, there can be built a bridge in that sense.
We have one last question from David Peter.
Not a question, but a comment, although I rather like the thought of ending with this violent conclusion of Horst's, which may at least satisfy Joacim with his demand for going beyond the canonical status which Warburg has already achieved. But if I may, Ekardt, I just want to make three sort of brief comments. The point about dance is a very clear one. I think Elizabeth or Betsy already made it clear that Warburg was fully aware of dance issues. I mean, ever since his analysis, of course, of the 1588 intermezzi. And I think I've somewhere written about this, but he certainly knew Kleist, and he certainly very well, and he certainly knew the Marionettentheater. And the Marionettentheater, as you know, ends with this extraordinary, has this extraordinary conclusion in which he posed one of the fundamental Warburgian problems that comes out again in the question of Besonnenheit and Denkraum, the relationship between automaticity and contrivance. I mean, this is a really fundamental aspect of Warburg, that, you know, our innocence was taken away when we could no longer respond automatically, and I mean, this is the conclusion of the Marionettentheater, and we have to think about what we do. Innocence went, reflection came. I mean, this is a real central issue for Warburg. He definitely knew Kleist, and actually one of the things that I've been asking about the library that we have, the great library which we have, when I went to look for Kleist the other day, I saw we only had one 19th century edition of Kleist, and I asked myself, you will have to give me feedback on this. Why is there no more Kleist in the library? And the answer I was given was, well, we've got the German Historical Institute 3 steps away. So this is one of the issues that one has when one wants to have a self-contained library. Do we keep it all to ourselves, or we just go for Lessing and Kleist a half a mile away? That's an interesting sort of institutional problem. I just wanted to say one thing about, before we get to the broader issue, I want to make one philological comment. I'm not a Hobbesian, but the strange thing about Quentin's excellent talk, I mean, all the talks this morning were excellent, and I have to say I'm sorry that no one other than Sigrid, but then she suppressed it, took up the very important introduction to the questions we are facing today by Peter Miller. But anyway, to move forward with one small philological issue, I don't know how this, the extent to which this is already present in the Hobbesian literature, but the whole question of dissimulation seems to have been sort of skipped here when we think of Franz. I don't see as an introitus, although it certainly serves introitus. Introitus is the forehead which contains the signs of what is within. But as we know, already by the time of Hobbes, there's this skepticism about the reliability of the sign of the Franz to the interior. So frontispiece, of course, comes from Franz rather than anything else, one. And two, the persona fictione, persona, the meaning that I always assumed Hobbes was referring to, was not to persons, but to masks, which makes much more sense. Persona means mask. So again, you have this question of deception in the reading of faces and the importance of deception in the book. So this I leave for the Hobbes scholars to resolve. But I was very touched at the end with this discussion about, and again, Betsy came to the fore here, the discussion about iconography and iconology and the difference it made to Warburg. Because Hochewerf, this thought came to me this morning, he was really a boring scholar for the most part, if I may say something not so good about the dead. The Hochewerf was a slightly boring connoisseur. He did have this response to Warburg, but the person who Hochewerf taught, one of the people that Hochewerf taught was van der Waal, who started the dial iconographic classification. And one of the things I have discovered as I've been trying to get my colleagues not only to get funds for digitization, but to think of the implications of the work of Warburg in the digital age. You know, we are long beyond the Benjaminian age of mechanical reproduction. We now completely in the age of digital reproduction, totally different state of affairs. At any rate, we're trying to get grants, for digitization like everybody else. And what do you find when we think about the digitization of our precious photographic collection? That we are struggling with this antiquated, very un-Warburgian, simplistic system of dial, started by van der Waal, derived from student of Hochewerf. So we really have to go beyond this. And going beyond this entails, curiously enough, going back to Warburg. So thank you so much this morning for this extraordinary range of talks. Thank you all. Thank you for being present.